So, in this last section of the podcast, I'm going to try to tackle the institution of patriarchy, give you sort of the broad overview, but we're also going to look at some specific comparisons here. So, ever since the emergence of the first civilizations, humans have lived in a patriarchal world. Men have been regarded as superior to women, sons were preferred over daughters, men held legal and property rights that women did not. Politics and decision-making were ruled by men. Men could marry more than one woman. Men claimed the right to rule the sexual lives of their wives, their daughters, sisters, and their families. So all civilizations were patriarchal, just like all civilizations had slaves. But the extent of patriarchy and the way that patriarchy was expressed varied quite a bit from civilization to civilization. So I'm going to look specifically at patriarchy in China and how it changed over time, and then we're going to end off with a comparison between Athens and Sparta, something we've touched on a little bit in the primary documents already. So the great revered empire of classical China was the Han Dynasty, and they ruled for roughly 450 years or so. We studied Confucius, the great teacher, and we know that Confucius lived around 500 BCE. During the lifetime of Confucius, his influence in the grand scheme of things in China was minor, but during his lifetime his influence was minor, but the rise of the Han Dynasty sort of changed that. With the rise of the Han came the rise of Confucianism as the state's preferred belief system. Now, before Confucianism and before the Han, there was a long-held belief about the importance of opposites. And this is the principle of the yin and the yang. So, with the emergence of the Han and the emergence of Confucianism as the Han's belief system, the yin and the yang came to be viewed not as equal but as unequal, and they're also associated with gender. So we have yin and yang as opposites. Yang was masculine, yin was feminine. Yang was heaven, yin was earth. Yang was strength, yin was weakness. Yang was rationality, yin was emotion. Yang was light, yin was darkness, and so forth and so on. And the inferiority of females is really a central part of Confucian teaching. So this is spelled out in the notion of filial piety. So we have the 5 relationships. Everybody's subordinate to the emperor. The wife is subordinate to the husband. The child is subordinate to the parents. The older brother is subordinate to the younger brother. And the only equal relationship is among friends. So this notion held that a woman was subordinate to men. There's a Confucian adage that said, men go out, women stay in. One other idea that's helpful to be aware of is the notion of the 3 obediences, and this is the Confucian idea that a woman has 3 obediences in her lifetime. A woman is first subordinate to her father, then her husband, and finally, in old age, to her son. After the fall of the Zhou dynasty, there's a period in Chinese history known as the Warring States period. Now, the Qin ended the Warring States period, and then the Han overthrew the Qin. The fall of the Han sent China into a new Warring States period. And what this basically means is that after the fall of Han China in roughly 220, China became fragmented again and didn't become a unified country until 300 years later. This was a time of chaos in China, lots of violence, lots of fighting, and all this chaos really discredited Confucianism in the eyes of many Chinese people. And other religions began to gain popularity, specifically Taoism and Buddhism. On top of the influence of these religions, which were less patriarchal than Confucianism, we see a lot of invasions by nomadic people from northern China, and these nomads will take over parts of China. And in nomadic societies, women were less restricted than they were in China. So this is moving forward into the next unit, but by the time of the Tang Dynasty in 618, writers and artists often depicted elite women as capable of handling legal and business affairs on their own. There's depictions of women riding horses and playing polo. So really this is part of the next unit, but we see women gaining more rights in China, culminating in the rule of a female empress who ruled with support from the Buddhist community. So that's something we'll be looking for in the next unit, how patriarchy sort of subsides a little bit in China and how there's a strong reaction against increased rights for women in China. Not only did patriarchies change over time, but they also vary quite a bit from one place to the next, and an often used example for this are the cases of Athens and Sparta, the two leading city-states of classical Greek civilization. And today, Athens is celebrated as the most important source of Western democracy, but women had far fewer rights in Athens than they did in Sparta, and Sparta was a military dictatorship. So, in Athens, women weren't allowed to participate in public life. In legal matters, women had to be represented by a guardian. Court records show that women were never referred to by their own name, just as someone's wife or someone's mother, but never their own name. So, like in China, Athenian women were expected to stay home, except for religious festivals or funerals, and within the home, women lived in different quarters than men. Within marriages, women were placed at a disadvantage right off the bat because typically they would be married when they were teenagers, 13, 14, 15 years old, and they would be marrying men who were 10 to 15 years older than they were. The main duty of women in Athens was to give birth to preferably sons, and sons would receive a formal education, whereas daughters would receive a limited education that focused on taking care of a household. So, Spartan society stood in glaring contrast to Athenian society. Early on in its history, Sparta was faced with a problem of feeding a growing population. So the population in Sparta was expanding, and they needed to do something in order to feed the whole population. And the way a lot of Greek communities dealt with this was establishing overseas colonies and sending people away to live on the colonies, and this helped spread Greek culture all throughout the Mediterranean. This isn't something that the Spartans did. They didn't go out and seek to establish these colonies in faraway lands. Instead, the Spartans simply conquered their neighbors and made the neighboring communities slaves to the Spartan state. And these enslaved people were called helots by the Spartans, and there were far more helots than there were citizens in Sparta. And Spartans always lived in fear that these helots would rise up and rebel against their Spartan masters. And this constant fear of rebellion shaped Spartan society and encouraged them to become completely militaristic and constantly ready for war. So, Spartans trained their military. All boys were removed from their families when they were 7, trained in military camps until they were 30 years old. The ideal for a Spartan male was to be a warrior, skilled in battle, able to endure hardship, willing to die for Sparta. So, it's ironic then that in this anti-democratic, militaristic society that women would have more rights than men. Like in Athens, women's primary role in Sparta was to give birth to warriors for Sparta. Women were encouraged, however, to have strong bodies, and they were allowed to take part in sporting events, running, wrestling, throwing discus and javelin, riding chariots, things that would be out of the question in Athens. The belief was that the strongest babies came from strong young people, and women typically married when they were around the age of 18, and they married to men who were around their own age. Every marriage came with a trial period to see if the couple could produce children. That was the most important thing. And if they could not, divorce was allowed. So, Sparta was clearly patriarchal. Women were basically served as breeding machines for the military system, and they lacked a formal role in public life. But it was a lighter patriarchy than in Athens. So, if a woman died in childbirth, she was honored the same way a soldier would be honored if he was killed in battle, because they were both considered, like, she was giving birth to a warrior. They both lost their lives protecting Sparta, so they were honored alike. So, just to recap the central idea of this podcast, there are inequalities in all early civilizations. This continued into the classical civilizations. All classical civilizations had a clearly defined social hierarchy. While most people were poor, there was a small group of privileged elites in each society. Each society practiced slavery, but it was far more widespread in Greece and Rome than it was in China or India. And finally, each society was patriarchal in its own way, but the extent of that patriarchy differed from one society to the next and could change over time. So, this is the end of episode 6, Social Classes in the Classical World. Thank you for listening.